This is the IBJ Podcast for the week of Monday, January 27th, 2025, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. You might remember a couple of episodes last year when we unpacked Mayor Joe Hogsett's plans to establish a Major League Soccer team in downtown Indianapolis. That's no easy task. Among other things, the team would need a stadium to play in. The city earmarked about 16 acres in the southeast quadrant of the mile square and held discussions with MLS officials, but we were left with a cliffhanger whether the city would get state approval for the taxing district that would help pay for the stadium. That's where we'll kick off this week's podcast, but we're going to cover much more ground in this sector of the mile square. That includes the newly announced $78 million practice and training facility for the Indiana Fever, which will be developed less than a soccer pitch away from the prospective stadium site. In the other direction, the Fever facility will be catercorner to the campus containing Commission Row, Bicentennial Unity Plaza, and Gainbridge Fieldhouse, the home of the Fever and the Indiana Pacers. A block to the west of Gainbridge is the future site of a $312 million development that will include a high-end hotel and a 4,000-seat concert venue. The next step in that development process has already begun, although it bears noting that a couple of new hotels a few blocks away already are preparing to open. So, what do many of the latest developments in the southeast quadrant of the mile square have in common? Real estate developer Herb Simon and his family, which own a majority stake in the Indiana Pacers and Indiana Fever. It's a lot to take in, so we're going to take it step by step. IBJ real estate reporter Mickey Shuey will be here to walk us through all the latest developments, or in some cases, the lack of obvious progress, in this burgeoning sports, entertainment, and hospitality sector of downtown. Here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Mickey Shuey, who covers real estate for IBJ. Thanks for making time to put our heads together on these latest developments.
Thanks for having me.
So we've done 2 podcasts in the last year just about the Hogsett administration's effort to establish a Major League Soccer franchise in Indianapolis, which among other things would require the financing and construction of a soccer stadium. The administration has earmarked a collection of parcels over about 16 acres of land that are just south of the city-county building and the Cummins distribution headquarters. Another way to think about this is think 2 blocks east of Gainbridge Fieldhouse. This just came to me. Do we have any indication yet of how much this would cost?
Well, it's not going to be cheap, whatever happens. From the land acquisition to building the stadium itself, it's going to cost in the hundreds of millions for sure. But really, it kind of runs the gamut right now on stadium costs because Cincinnati, who opened their stadium, I believe, in 2019, TQL Stadium, that cost about $250 million. And in St. Louis City Park, now known as actually Energizer Park, they spent about $461 million on their stadium.
How recent was that? Was that post-pandemic?
Yeah, that opened, I believe, in 2022.
Okay, yeah. So that's just an indication of how much more construction costs nowadays.
And then down in Miami, Inter Miami is looking at building a $1.3 billion stadium district. They haven't identified specifically how much the stadium itself would cost, but that's what they say they want to put into that.
So when we last spoke, the city needed to submit a request to the state to create a new taxing district that would pay about 80% of the cost for a soccer-specific stadium.
Correct.
The group of currently anonymous investors who would own the team would cover the other 20%.
Correct. They would cover the other 20%. But just to clarify, the term owner is a little bit of a misnomer because they're actually just investors in the team. The Major League Soccer as a whole would actually own the club, and then they would be investors in the specific club.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It's kind of a convoluted situation, but that's how they break it down.
So they'd always be investors in the team, but they would never actually own the team.
Correct.
Now, the city finally submitted that request to create the taxing district to the state in August. City officials had hoped the request would be approved quickly so this prospective investor group could feel confident enough in the project to apply to the MLS by the end of the year. What has happened with that request since August?
Well, from the outside looking in, not much. The city sent that in August, and really since then, I think they, and I can vouch for myself, I've looked at every state budget committee meeting agenda expecting to see it on there, and it just has never come through. So really, it sounds like there's a lot of machinations happening behind the scene right now to try and kind of, I guess, get the city's ducks in a row. Obviously, there's a new administration with Mike Braun coming in as governor, so that certainly is playing a role. But we really don't know much about what's happened since then, other than, as the city put it, conversations have continued on and off.
So explain exactly what is supposed to be happening on the state level, because it's not like a bunch of legislators are sitting in a room, or maybe they are, saying yes or no.
Right. So what it is that the city sent this PSDA, this Professional Sports Development Area Tax District Plan, to the Indiana Finance Authority, which has been analyzing the city's request for that PSDA. And by the way, that district would essentially redirect various state and local tax revenue streams, not including property taxes, to pay for stadium bonds. Once the Indiana Finance Authority has completed that process, which it sounds like they're at least very close to completing that process if they have not already, it would then make a recommendation either for or against the allocation of that money to the State Budget Committee, which is a legislator-led body, a bipartisan body that has purview over state funds.
And then they could say yes.
Right. They could say yes. They could theoretically say no. It really just kind of depends on the situation. I will say, though, that they've generally been supportive of spending money that's already been allocated in state law. For example, IEDC has received quite a bit of money over the past few years for the LEAP district, despite reservations of a couple of the members on the committee.
The other thing that I take it could happen is that, speaking of legislators, they could insert themselves into this process and basically make the whole approval process moot. They could just make it happen.
They could. I mean, they could theoretically write legislation into something that's going through the House and the state Senate already and basically add in a clause that says that XYZ can happen with this soccer stadium district. They also could just write it into the budget and say, here's the money, or here's some of the money, because the state law that was passed as part of Senate Bill 7, as it was known at the time, that also included the Gainbridge Fieldhouse renovations and a bunch of other stuff, that basically said that the state will pay for up to 80% of the bonds using the funds. So they don't have to cover all 80% theoretically, but they'll cover up to 80%.
So they essentially just can preempt this approval process.
Correct.
With legislation.
Correct.
Okay. So what does the Hogsett administration, which has been behind this push for the MLS franchise, say about how long it could take to get clarity from the state?
Speaking with Mayor Hogsett last week, he said that he really expects the stadium will be a point of discussion throughout the legislative session this year. And that began just this month, and there's still 2.5, 3 months left in the session. So we've got a long way to go in that regard. But he also stopped short of predicting that a bill dedicated to the matter is going to be considered in either the House or the Senate. And as we discussed, stadium language could theoretically be written into the budget.
So again, with the investors, I refer to them as the anonymous investor group. I mean, this has been going on for almost a year now. And I mean, do we know anything more about who these folks might be?
Not really. There's a lot of speculation out there right now, but there's not a lot of facts out there right now on this. We certainly have seen a lot of movement, as we'll talk about on the real estate side. That's kind of got people pointing fingers, but for now, the leader of the person who's trying to bring this group together, Tom Glick, he's a North Carolina longtime sports executive. He also brought together the Charlotte team. He's been very mum on what is actually happening behind the scenes. So we don't have a lot of good read there, and the city's not really willing to discuss either who's involved.
So it doesn't feel like we've had a lot of progress, except several things have happened behind the scenes that would indicate otherwise, especially regarding the land that you would need to assemble for this project.
Yeah, I mean, where do I start with that? I mean, I mean, we've got a lot of moving pieces there. First, the city and the Capital Improvement Board, which owns or operates most of the sports and convention facilities. Think Victory Field, think Gainbridge Fieldhouse. They operate Lucas Oil Stadium on behalf of the state. They're already in discussions about stadium design and looking at designers for the proposed stadium. But the city's also working to assemble some of the land within that district that we talked about.
Yeah, about 16 acres or so,
Yeah. It really is focused on a few major parcels. The Hogsett administration has said that it's going to exercise an option to buy the Indianapolis downtown heliport property. That's at 51 South New Jersey Street. But the heliport still needs to be decommissioned before that happens. A process that should be completed by the end of this year, really. And then the city's also signed a contract to purchase the 301 East Washington parcel. That's the small presidential park and parking lot right next to the Julia Carson Transit Center.
Is that what they would call the pocket park?
Yes.
Smaller than your front yard.
So that is one of 3 parcels that were purchased by an affiliate holding company controlled by the Simon family, Herb Simon, the owner of the Pacers, last year.
Majority owner of the Pacers.
Yes.
Yeah. So here we have our first mention of billionaire Herb Simon and his family, who figure prominently in the rest of this podcast. So to remind our listeners, Herb Simon and his family have a majority stake in the Indiana Pacers and Indiana Fever, specifically the company that owns those two
Correct.
teams.
Pacers Sports and Entertainment.
Pacers Sports and Entertainment. Both those teams play in Gainbridge Fieldhouse, 2 blocks west of the prospective soccer stadium site. It is very cozy in that part of downtown when it comes to sports, apparently. So Herb and perhaps other family members are widely believed to be involved somehow with this prospective soccer team investor group. And as evidence, we can look at the family's 3 land acquisitions in the area. So through a holding company, they bought, a 5.2 acre surface lot.
Correct.
At 101 South Alabama, directly east of what folks probably know as the Virginia Avenue parking garage. The company bought the parcel at 301 West Washington, next to the Transit Center, in November. And then in December, the company bought the parking lot 355 East Pearl Street from AES, Indiana. I know, folks, it's tough to figure this out with a map, but these are contiguous parcels in this area.
And worth noting that they are already in the process, as I just mentioned, of selling the 301 East Washington to the city.
So for the Simons altogether, that's nearly, $16.7 million for 6.8 acres of undeveloped downtown land. So what has the Simon family said about these acquisitions?
On the Simon family side, they've really tried to distance themselves from the whole inclination that they might be involved in soccer. In April, a family representative told me that the family's interest in the Alabama parking lot site, that big lot next to Virginia Avenue garage, quote unquote, predated soccer. And he also said that the acquisition was entirely separate from city's plans for that parcel. Specifically, they wanted to have it for staging and some other things related to Gainbridge Fieldhouse.
Yeah.
He hasn't shared anything else with me. He hasn't commented on the later purchases. As for Dan Parker, the chief deputy mayor of Indianapolis, basically the right hand of Mayor Hogsett, he said that the Simons, quote, are not acting as a conduit, end quote, for the city in acquiring property, even though each parcel now under the family's control is integral or would be integral to a stadium.
This is, splitting hairs, but would Simon necessarily need to give the city the land? Is this public-private partnership?
It's up for debate because they could have some sort of arrangement where Simons own the land that goes beneath a stadium, but that would make things very convoluted. The Hogsett administration seems like it wants to make things as clean-cut as possible in this situation. So I would expect that one way or another, the city or the Capital Improvement Board are going to acquire those and other parcels in this site.
Here's something that I've totally forgotten now. Who is supposed to own the stadium if the stadium gets constructed?
So according to the law in Senate Bill 7, the Capital Improvement Board would own the stadium, and they would have an operating agreement with the ownership group, either in a situation like the Fieldhouse with Pacers Sports Entertainment, where that's managed by them, or in a situation kind of like Lucas Oil Stadium, although that's a state-owned property where the CIB operates it. That part is to be determined, but it would be owned by the Capital Improvement Board.
And the Capital Improvement Board, again, I mean, kind of quasi-public agency, if you will, essentially takes all of these giant facilities off the tax rolls, among other things.
Correct.
But, also they all need to be able to work together, to make best use of all that real estate. So we have a board that controls all that real estate.
Correct.
We've reached another milestone in the wider conversation about sports facilities downtown. It's a big wrinkle. It is a $78 million wrinkle, and we're going to get to that in a second. First, quickly run through what else needs to happen in order to establish an MLS team on this site in Indianapolis.
Well, there's quite a few steps left. First and foremost, the valuation of the professional sports development area map would need to be completed by the Indiana Finance Authority and passed along to the State Budget Committee. If the committee approves it, the State Budget Agency, which is basically the money-giving arm of the state, would greenlight it as well and basically make those funds available. And then a formal application for a Major League Soccer club would have to come forth, and that's really going to be the foundation of the city's determination on whether it moves forward with the stadium at all. They have said multiple times that they will only build a stadium if they are given the okay by Major League Soccer to have a team in Indianapolis.
They're saying we're not going to pull a bait and switch on you.
They're basically going the opposite direction of what they did with the Hoosier Dome to bring the Colts here. They're not doing a build it and they will come situation. They're basically doing a be able to build it and they will come. And then after that, and this is something that's also happening along the same lines right now, is stadium design. And then, there's still the land acquisition and zoning aspects. Then you've got resolutions to sell bonds and financing the construction of the stadium if it were to move forward. Most of that, though, would be repaid by tax funds in the PSDA. Then you get to the MLS making its final decision.
So the MLS still hasn't made its final decision.
Right. But
until this point.
Right. But the stadium also is not going to be built again unless they say okay.
Got it. Okay. That's the last thing that needs to happen.
Basically, you need to have the runway fully constructed before takeoff can happen.
Do we have any sense of how long that would take?
The city is optimistic that they're going to be able to get through this process this year.
No kidding.
Yeah. They actually had hoped to have an application into Major League Soccer by the end of last year, but the delays with the State Budget Committee ultimately made that unfeasible. So, it sounds like in talking with the city that they're chugging along with it.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ Podcast. In my interview with reporter Mickey Shuey about major sports and hospitality projects planned in the southeast quadrant of the Mile Square and the roles played by the Herb Simon family. So let's move on to my $78 million wrinkle. Pacer Sports and Entertainment, which, as we mentioned, majority owned by the Herb Simon family, announced on January 16th, just last week, that it planned to spend $78 million to build a dedicated training complex for the Indiana Fever. And it would be built on a portion of the former Marion County Jail 1, one of 2 jails downtown, yes, both of which have been decommissioned. This is literally across the street from the soccer stadium site. So to orient folks now, again, I'm sorry we don't have a map for you. It would be directly northeast of Gainbridge Fieldhouse, that complex there, which includes the Simon-owned Commission Row restaurant and hospitality center, and directly west of the soccer site. So on the map of downtown, we literally could connect the dots from the land the Simons have purchased in the site for the proposed soccer stadium to the planned Fever facility, to Commission Row, to Gainbridge Fieldhouse, and then to a luxury hotel and conference center planned by the Simons across Pennsylvania Street from the Fieldhouse. And we'll get to that last part here in a few minutes. First, tell us about Marion County Jail 1. If I were to walk a couple blocks from this office to the jail site, what would I see happening?
Well, right now, you'd probably see a bit of demolition work happening.
A lot of exposed cells.
They are tearing down the jail as we speak. And as you're listening to this, they have about a 5.5-month process remaining on the demolition of that property. It began with interior demolition back in October, and they're hard at work tearing it down. So there's a lot of rubble sitting there at the corner of, especially at the corner of Delaware and Maryland streets.
Remind me, what had the city said in the past about plans for that property once the jail had been demolished? Because I think a lot of people were looking forward to having that land available for some sort of significant change in the offerings of downtown.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly have been conversations over the past couple of weeks about, or really the past week since this was announced, about whether this process was the right move for the city, because there had long been discussed an RFP process, request for proposals process, especially when the city was kind of looking at its real estate holdings along with like the city county building, when they were looking at maybe offloading that. And they, at that time, were saying that they expected there to be an RFP process alongside the demolition of the jail. But it seems that at some point last year in 2024, the conversation shifted to really, perhaps alongside the soccer conversation, make this parcel available for the Simons and then kind of figure out what to do with the other about acre parcel on the east side of the jail site, which is, as we'll discuss, is connected right to the stadium area.
Tell us quickly about the plans for this facility that I think, at least for now, would be called the Indiana Fever Sports Performance Center.
So it's a 3-story, 108,000 square foot facility that's set to open by May of 2027. That's around the time that the team starts its season. And the initial plans call for 2 regulation-sized basketball courts, full-service kitchen, a private outdoor courtyard, and a spa-style retreat space. And amenities will include infrared light therapy, saunas, steam rooms, heat studios, a float tank, multiple hydrotherapy pools, really the works. It'll also offer yoga and Pilates areas, a strength and conditioning space, and mental performance areas. And I should note that this is a project being developed through an interlocal agreement between Pacer Sports Entertainment, the City of Indianapolis, and the Capital Improvement Board of Marion County, with construction set to start as soon as August.
As you're kind of alluding to, this is kind of a complicated deal. Who, for example, would own the land? Who would own the building? How does this deal work?
The facility itself would be constructed and operated by an affiliate of Pacer Sports Entertainment. We don't have that affiliate's specific name yet, but the Capital Improvement Board is expected to own the land beneath the structure following a transfer of the property from the city. And the CIB, just as it did for the Pacers with the Ascension St. Vincent Center on Delaware and the Colts facility out by 56th Street, they will have an operating agreement that will allow the facility to be donated to the public body, the CIB, at the conclusion of an agreed term. And those details have not been finalized.
It just strikes me, because I'm not very quick with this kind of stuff, it's sort of weird. The Pacer Sports and Entertainment is going to build a $76 million facility and eventually give it to the CIB.
That is correct.
I would love to have been in the meeting for that.
It's not something they haven't done before, though. They spent $50 million on the Delaware Street property for the Pacers. And at the end of this term, the year is escaping me on when that term ends, but that will be property of the CIB. That doesn't mean that they're not going to continue using the facility. It just really, it's an arrangement that the CIB prefers to have for its professional sports teams. I would think in the event that the teams do leave, the CIB can use those to market for future teams.
While the facility is in the hands of Pacer Sports and Entertainment, will it pay taxes on that building? And I just say that because, kind of alluding to the conversation we had earlier, a lot of people were looking forward to that jail site being reused in a way that would generate property taxes.
So I don't know the answer to that question at this time. I think a lot of that is still being ironed out. Certainly, it creates an interesting situation. I would say that, if anything, they might have a pilot or a payment in lieu of taxes arrangement that could be an option, but we don't know the details yet on what that will look like.
So what was really extraordinary about this announcement was that, at least for me, it came completely out of the blue. Like when you're talking about finding a new use for city-owned land, usually there's a lot of discussion about potential users. As you mentioned, I mean, sometimes there is a bid process. If nothing else, word usually leaks out to our sources and we at least sniff it out a little bit. Do we have a sense of how this deal came together? You alluded to there being some kind of discussions fairly recently.
So the discussions actually go back to as early as, I believe, April of last year. They've really been working on this for the past 9 months, but they've been doing it basically, it sounds like, in very small areas, very small spaces where only a few people are involved, so that way it doesn't leak out. Because, I mean, certainly there's been a lot of talk about the future of the Fever and Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, and what that's going to look like. So I think they wanted to kind of make sure that this was the real deal before anything got out about a new facility. So I think they were just really kind of playing it close to the vest.
And did you speak with Mel Raines about this?
I did, yeah. So Mel Raines, the CEO of Pacer Sports Entertainment, said, quote, "When we were looking at the best possible site for this, and upon understanding that the JL1 site was coming down, we approached the mayor's office with our idea and what we thought it could potentially look like." And she also said that Hogsett was, quote, "very supportive."
And apparently so.
Yes.
Now, the Fever recently have been using facilities in Gainbridge Fieldhouse for practice and training. Why does the team need a freestanding dedicated facility?
So what Raines told me is that there continues to be growth within the WNBA, and given the upward trajectory of the Fever, it really made it imperative for the organization to have a facility of its own. And she said the design of the project will also feature a specific focus on serving the needs of female athletes and creating public and community spaces.
I'm sure one of the questions people have as well, I mean, the Fever play, 4 or 5 months out of the year. What happens to this facility when they're not here, when they're not playing?
I'm sure that it'll continue to be used. I mean, we saw this week, even though it was her birthday, Caitlin Clark was shooting threes at the Salesforce court inside Gainbridge Fieldhouse. So the players will continue to use it in the off season, but there's also going to be opportunities for camps, for community events, and for a whole host of other opportunities for the team and for female athletes to engage with the community.
We've been talking for 4 decades, at least, in Indianapolis about giant sports facilities and the continual arms race of new and bigger places. I mean, the Fieldhouse, which was built 30 years ago, maybe even less than that, maybe 25, I mean, was a reaction to the limitations of Market Square Arena. They recently did a $300-some million upgrade. Is the same thing happening in the WNBA now? I mean, obviously, we just went through, just a blockbuster year where, ratings exploded, the presence just in popular culture exploded. Is this something now where, teams have the money to do this?
Yeah, I think a lot of teams are embracing this opportunity. I mean, we've also seen other teams before this moment that the NBA is having. They were starting to already invest in their teams. You've got teams like Las Vegas Aces, whose facility opened last April before the blockbuster season that began. The Seattle Storm and the Phoenix Mercury have also invested in facilities. And the Chicago Sky said in July that it would also move forward with a team-specific training complex. And then the New York Liberty have also made a similar commitment. So we're really seeing a lot of movement right now amongst owners and investors in these WNBA teams. And I should also note in WSL soccer teams to create dedicated facilities for these athletes who, like 20, 30 years ago, it would be unheard of for them to have their own facilities.
And the rationale that you hear from major sports franchises for these bigger facilities, for men and for the women, is that it is necessary in order to attract the best players.
Yeah.
Can I say the thing that everybody is thinking? This wouldn't get the city's cooperation, wouldn't be seen as a vital need, and wouldn't get built if it weren't for the massive splash that Caitlin Clark made in her rookie season.
I don't think that that's incorrect in many ways. And even the leadership with the Pacer Sports Entertainment, Mel Raines herself, noted that it really was underscored for the team this year that having a facility of its own, especially with the talent that's on the roster and the talent that it could bring to the roster, didn't have a space of their own to call home. So I think there's certainly going to be those who say that like this isn't going to happen without Caitlin Clark. And I don't know that that's an incorrect assumption, but I also think that we've seen a lot of forward momentum in women's sports over the past 4 to 5 years, certainly over the past year.
Now, here is a spare thought, getting back to the real estate that occurred to me. Is it possible that the Simon family wanted to buy the properties in the proposed soccer stadium so they could control what is developed next to the site where the team wanted the practice facility? That they indeed really are not interested in the soccer?
It certainly is. It could have just been a defensive move. We've got no indication that they are part of it, but it's a lot of people kind of putting pieces together that they think fit. So for all we know, it could be exactly what you said, that they were just trying to make sure that they had control and a say in what's built next to them. But on the flip side, they also are the ones who have been speculated the most about related to this. So I think a lot of people are letting the wish be the father of the thought in this case. And whether or not that pans out will obviously remain to be seen. But it makes sense why people are saying the Simons could be involved.
And again, this is just me spitballing, but I mean, they could have been sitting there in the offices at Gainbridge thinking, okay, that jail's coming down. And this is catercorner to Bicentennial Plaza. And we have a lot of stuff that we want to accomplish. We need to get in there and make sure we're protecting our interests.
Yeah, I mean, really, that's the closest piece of available real estate. So it would make sense that if the next available piece of property is the jail, that they're going to want to go there. But it also makes sense that they would want to scoop up other land that could be nearby just to give them the flexibility of operating and having their options open to them.
And for the largest land acquisition, I believe the largest land acquisition that they had, that they had said, this predates soccer. We need to have better staging for things that go on at Gainbridge Fieldhouse. We could just take them at the word that that actually is what they wanted.
Yeah, I mean, they do use a lot of parking for major events. And I think, and that was something that they were working for from the source that I talked to. They were trying to get that site for 4 or 5 years. But I think the NBA All-Star events last year really kind of underscored that they wanted to have more available real estate for their uses for big events. I mean, when you look at something like Taylor Swift, which obviously went to Lucas Oil, she brings in 100 semis to help with the setup. So, I mean, certainly Gainbridge isn't going to get that, but the traffic that it brings in to put together the event, that's going to need to go somewhere and park.
As you mentioned, the Fever practice facility will not take up the entire jail space. There will be, on the eastern portion of the block, the portion that would be facing the soccer site would still be undeveloped. Do we have any idea what might happen there?
That kind of remains to be seen, but in talking with Dan Parker with the city, they really seem to want to have that tied in with whatever happens with the stadium plans. They haven't necessarily ruled out an RFP process for it, but it seems like they're just kind of letting the rest of the process play out before they make a decision on what will happen there. Because, I mean, that site in the city's own report about development opportunities within the PSDA, I mean, that's identified as kind of like a good parcel for apartments or a hotel or a mixed-use development of some kind. And you should note that report, the Hunden report, as I've come to call it, because it's done by Hunden Partners out of Chicago, that did not include contemplation of a Fever practice facility on the jail parcel. That was all earmarked for like a mixed-use development.
Now, speaking of demolition, we have some movement on another major project that we've referred to from the Herb Simon family, this one across Pennsylvania Street from the entrance to Gainbridge. And we've discussed this on the podcast previously. An investment group led by the Simon family plans to spend more than $300 million to construct a 13-story luxury hotel and a connected 4,000-seat live music venue on the property with plans to open both venues in late 2027. Now, that development will take the place of the century-old CSX railroad servicing building at 230 South Pennsylvania Street. Did I see on the city agenda recently that demolition of that building is now scheduled?
In fact, it's actually now underway. They've started tearing out the inside of the CSX property, and they anticipate, speaking with a family representative actually just today, they anticipate that over the next 5 to 6 months, that building will be coming down. They hope to start on actual construction by the end of this year. So that work is actively underway.
Wow, that'd be a shame if it happened during the playoffs. Well, not my $300 million. Tell me about the hotel.
So the hotel is going to be a 170-room Shinola hotel, total of 13 stories, and it would be the upscale hotelier's second location, joining Detroit, where the company is essentially based. It's expected to feature a mix of deluxe rooms and suites, along with high-end restaurant, a bar, and potentially a Shinola retail store. Shinola is best known for kind of high-fashion merchandise like watches and handbags.
And again, when will it be finished?
By the end of 2027.
I wanted to mention a hotel story on your beat from this week. Downtown's newest hotel is expected to open in late February, following a 6-year off-and-on renovation of a historic former office building near Monument Circle. Tell me about it.
So the Aloft in Indianapolis, what was formerly the Stockyards Bank and Trust building at 136 East Market Street. So it's kind of smack dab in the middle of the 100 block of Market Street on the north side. That is going to open by February 21st, according to the general manager for the hotel. And they've been working on that, as you said, for the past 6 years on and off. But that project is going to make that property, it's 133 years old now, but they're turning that into a 128-room hotel.
Now, this is, to me, really significant news. I mean, we work down here. We all work within walking distance of all this stuff. The Mile Square has had several hotel projects in historic office buildings that have lingered in a kind of a limbo for years. By jumping into the market now, what kind of special events downtown would this hotel be able to serve?
I should note that this is not the only hotel that is expected to open in the coming months. We've also got the Intercontinental, which certainly is an interesting story in and of itself.
Yeah, right off the surface.
But the fact that these hotels are looking at opening this early in the year means that they're going to be available for WNBA All-Star, for Big Ten basketball championships. We've got both the women's and the men's this year, as well as the NCAA tournament. I mean, they'll be available.
Oh, that's right. We have a regional.
Yeah, a regional.
Yeah, right.
At Lucas Oil Stadium. Well, 2024 was a huge year for tourism, especially with Taylor Swift at the tail end of the year. Most notably, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for the city's hotels, especially new ones, to capture some captive audiences and give them opportunities to see the space.
I get the impression that the Aloft price point would be somewhere below the Intercontinental and, say, the Shinola.
For sure. The Intercontinental is going to be branded as a luxury hotel. And I believe the Shinola would either be luxury or upper scale. Aloft is, I guess you could say, a more accessible level, but the price range for that would be about $169 to $199 on a given day. I mean, certainly during big events, those numbers are going to skyrocket just like all the hotels downtown do, probably to like the 220s, 230s, maybe a little higher.
Yeah, or when Taylor Swift comes back 10 years from now.
Yes.
Somewhere maybe in the thousands.
Yes, but really it's a more accessible price point it's really aimed at younger travelers, those who kind of want a do-it-all sort of space because it has like gaming areas and it has like a co-working space, a bar. So they've kind of got a mix of everything there for kind of younger age travelers.
I imagine you could do a lot worse than being 2.5 blocks away from Gainbridge Fieldhouse, which it is. Again, given the second half of the NBA season, the fever season coming up this summer, and at some point, maybe even an MLS club.
Absolutely. I mean, there's not a whole lot of real estate opportunities available downtown right now. And I mean, we're certainly seeing some conversions like the Angie building at 130 East Washington that's being converted to apartments. But there's not a lot of vacant parcels downtown except for that Market East district where this stadium could go. So it'll be interesting over the next 6 months to 6 years to see where everything goes.
Well, I love that they reuse old buildings. Creative uses for old buildings are great. And I'm sure that we'll have something kind of along those lines to talk about in the next few months.
I'm sure we will.
So, hey, thanks for all your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for me.
My thanks again to Mickey Shuey. And folks, before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few stories in this week's edition of IBJ that I want to draw to your attention. First up, Hancock Health has expanded its reach beyond healthcare over the last 7 years to become a master developer of a 160-acre medical, retail, and housing project in western Hancock County. Mickey Shuey details the evolution of Hancock Gateway Park. Also in this week's issue, Daniel Bradley examines the influx of out-of-state investment firms buying single-family homes in central Indiana and how cities are seeking limits on single-family rentals. And Daniel Lee has a story of a Carmel firm that has launched an AI-powered app that provides mental health services. And again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or, of course, online at ibj.com. And I will say, it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest local business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business, community, and economy if you're a subscriber. We're running a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months, just to get a sense of how valuable and original this content is. Just go to ibj.com and click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ Podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.